I'm really honored to be joined by my friend Jamil Dakwar today. Before I introduce Jamil, just a couple of words about things that we have coming up. Next Friday, the 24th, I'm going to be joined by former Congressman Jamal Bowman, who's going to talk about his experience in Congress, which I think should be an interesting conversation. And then the week after that, we're going to be doing some different things because my book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, is coming out on the 28th of this month. And so the first event in New York will be on the night of Wednesday, the 29th with Ayman Mohadeen of MSNBC. And then there's going to be a bunch more events in New York and then in other places around the country. So we'll be alerting folks to that. So we're going to have a series of other conversations about the book in subsequent weeks with other guests. But today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Jamil Dakwar, who is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Program. He formerly worked at Adala, which represents the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. He's an adjunct professor at New York University and Hunter College, and will be speaking in his personal capacity about these questions of repression of pro-Palestinian activism and speech with the new Trump administration. So, Jamil, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Peter. Glad to be with you and with all your supporters.
As always, people should put questions in the chat. So, Jamil, I guess I wanted to just start with a kind of a broad question, which is, what do you anticipate when President Trump takes office again in terms of what might change or intensify in terms of restrictions on protests, activism, speech of people who are involved and concerned about the rights of Palestinians?
I think we are expecting a worsening and serious crackdown on protesters and people who are organizing for Palestinian rights in this country. And I believe that this is going to be a continuation of some of the threats that were made, some of the actions that were already being taken, whether by local or state governments or private entities like universities or public universities. But this time, what we will be seeing is that they will be supported by the federal government fully. I also wanted to make it very clear that the Biden administration, the outgoing administration, has not been good on this issue. In fact, there have been a serious and troubling actions and inaction that had allowed and would allow new administration to be able to double down and to expand the repression against Palestinian rights advocacy in the United States. And then we go into specific examples. But I think the writing has been on the wall for a long time. I mean, it has not started, as many of you know, only after October 7th. Repression of Palestinian rights advocacy and activism in the United States started really way back. And I think if particularly as a matter of law, and a matter of policies of the United States government, it started really in the late 1960s with including different aspects of Palestinian activism, whether it's humanitarian aid, whether in the immigration laws, whether it's in the outlawing representation, legitimate representation of the Palestinian people, like the PLO. For example, the only time the Congress outlawed and designated an organization as a terrorist organization. Again, a designation that by Congress, not by the executive branch, was done the first time against the PLO back in 1987. So what we will be seeing after January 20th, next week, and most likely even on day one, because some of the reporting, for example, Reuters, I believe, reported that one of the first executive orders that will be issued by Trump that will be prioritizing deportation of students, international students who are expressing support for Hamas. So we can talk about what does that mean and what that would look like. But when I said the writing was on the wall, Peter, I just wanted to mention a few things for people here. We've seen a number of things that have been taking place. For example, the ADL, one of the first things that they did back in November of 2023 was sending a letter to all universities and also with a message to the Department of Justice, obviously, to investigate Student for Justice in Palestine groups as terrorist organizations and in violating material support laws. This was echoed by actions by, for example, Governor DeSantis, who acted and used Florida anti-terrorism laws and material support laws in order to suspend two Student for Justice for Palestine chapters at the University of Florida. And then we've heard Representative Pelosi calling to investigate protesters who were calling for ceasefire for connections to Russia and calling on the FBI to do that investigation to see whether there are any connections between the protesters and Russia and potentially other foreign targets. The same ADL, for example, called protesters who were protesting on college campuses as pro-Iranian supporters. We then saw the House committee, on the Republican House committee, starting a McCarthy-like or even worse hearings, claiming to investigate anti-Semitism, but it was really targeting pro-Palestinian activism and advocacy, including academic institutions. And then we saw the DOJ, the Department of Justice itself, have taken action under the Biden administration and is currently investigating Palestinian American and other organizations for violating of FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And not only that, I can report to all of you, I taught a short session, a course at the University of California, Irvine last week. At the end of my teaching at the law school, one of my students shared with me an email she received from the Department of Justice claiming that they have open investigation, the Department of Justice, not the Department of Education. This is, I think, the first of its kind. Department of Justice, open investigations into anti-Semitism against UC Irvine. And the email was sent to different university community members, asking them as part of an outreach by DOJ, again, DOJ under Biden, to share with them any experiences that relate to forms of anti-Semitism or acts of anti-Semitism. And then I would want to add two more things. Department of Education investigations into Palestinian rights activism that was in response to complaints submitted by pro-Israel and other organizations that claimed that universities were not cracking down enough, were not shutting down protests in support of Palestinian rights, using Title VI, which basically would eventually, if those investigations were accepted or were be thoroughly investigated and concluded, would defund or restrict federal funding to those academic institutions. So what happened is that multiple of those investigations that were based on complaints, many of them based on the misguided weaponization of anti-Semitism and treating any criticism of Zionism or Israel as anti-Semitism, etc. And the final thing is the cracking down on protests and protesters, what we've seen all over the country. That has not happened during Trump. It happened during the Biden administration. Police departments, campus police, other law enforcement agencies engaging in surveillance, investigating, questioning people for social media posts. So all of that is going to worsen under Trump. And all of that will mean that the Trump administration, with the people that nominated for DHS secretary, to Secretary of State, to Attorney General, and of course people in the White House, all agree that there need to be a concerted effort to clamp down and crack down on Palestinian rights advocacy in the United States. So we can talk more into detail, but I wanted to make sure that we understand that this is not something that Trump is instituting. This is something that's been there by laws, some of the actions taken by universities, some of the state actions, but some of that was also the federal government in action also to protect free speech and association rights of student groups and others has been abysmal under the Biden administration. That is now going to be used in order to expand the use of the anti-terrorism framework, using immigration laws in order to threaten and to, in fact, shut down many of the activism that we've seen over the past year or so.
Thank you, Jamil. Right. It's a very important point to remember that these things aren't just starting with Trump. And indeed, I think in the history of American repression of free speech, these things are almost always a bipartisan affair. You know, the Communist Party of the United States was banned under Harry Truman before Eisenhower and even the kind of height of the McCarthy era, even under a Democratic administration. There's so many different legal efforts that you're describing that could restrict people's rights. Maybe we can just go through the different mechanisms. You talked about material support for terrorism and the idea that DeSantis could shut down a chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine on claims that they're providing material support for terrorism. How does that argument even work? I mean, right, these people are not sending weapons or fighters to Hamas. So what is even the logic that would allow you to say this was material support? And what have the courts said about these kind of claims?
I mean, these were bogus claims. They lack any evidence.
Mm.
We looked into all of these claims, at least in the context of the student movement.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.